getting tired of this book. I'm on part 2. Lord God, I think I got 2 parts left. Like, y'all can see I'm getting tired of this book. Hello, welcome back to my YouTube channel. I am Adri Cortee. The goal of my channel is to make academia entertaining and accessible for you. So if that sounds good, please make sure to like and comment and subscribe. Subscribing really helps me out. It helps grow the channel. So please make sure to take a second and go ahead and do it. Okay, so time to get into part 2 of my book review of A Year Like No Other. This book that Vanderbilt sent out to everybody at Vanderbilt. And it's about how they basically handled the COVID-19 pandemic. Part 1 is already up on my channel if you want to go check it out. Today I'm talking about part 2, and it's called The Road to Reopening. So I'll talk about the major theme of part 2, and then I'm going to talk about how Vanderbilt talks about money, how they talked about social justice, how they talked about kind of their response to COVID-19, and then I'm also going to talk about just some sort of silly stuff, just like last time, stuff that just made me laugh. The major theme that I found was they would reference all these positive interventions they did. They'd be like, we gave the students this much money, like they had a hardship fund. They talk about like their diversity, equity, inclusion, like DEI efforts. They talk about all these different things they did to sort of try to provide like a positive change to people at Vanderbilt and people in the Nashville community. They don't report basically any outcomes from their interventions. Like students reported that this intervention had been really helpful. So that was a major theme. And I think it's part of the reason that they wrote this book before the pandemic was over, because probably at the time they wrote this, they couldn't have talked about the outcomes. Like probably a lot of the interventions were still going on. So it makes me feel like they wrote about this so they didn't have to talk about the outcomes. They could just brag about doing good stuff. And we'll just get into sort of examples of those as we go throughout all of the different sections of this video. Vanderbilt employs me. It wasn't my intention to read this book and just say negative things about it. I was compelled to read it because I'd heard so many negative things about it from people within the Vanderbilt community. So I was really curious. And so I want to do the most balanced sort of review that I can. So I'm going to go through some positive things that I found as well. And they talk about how researchers James Crow and Robert Conahan joined the global biopharmaceutical company called AstraZeneca in the effort to find candidates for antibody-based treatments of COVID-19. And they ended up identifying antibodies that were capable of neutralizing the virus. If I'm not wrong, this was basically the first medicine you could take for COVID-19. So this is really cool. Like this was part of an effort at Vanderbilt. They also have a section where they're talking about transitioning everything to Zoom, more than 2,600 courses online with as many as 187 classes estimated to be happening all at the same time. During the first half of March alone, teachers uploaded more than 4,200 hours of video to this online resource they were using. So I thought the Zoom numbers are really cool and illustrate really well like a giant effort that teachers made to move all of their classes basically online and figure out how to do that effectively. They also talk about the campaign they used to try to get people to wear masks and to like socially distance. This guy says, we understood that more clinical looking designs would not make sense in students' homes. So we did what we could do to soften the design. And they were like, oh, the solution is squirrels. So I thought this was a really cute idea. And there are literally so many squirrels on Vanderbilt's campus. This one time I was eating my lunch on campus outside, and I swear to you, a squirrel like came up at me, tried to take the lunch. Like, and I'll put an example here of like what that marketing campaign looked like. I'll show the one they reference. It says, don't be that squirrel. And they were like, by employing squirrel shaming as a stand-in for students, calling each other out over not following the rules. So I thought that was funny, the fact that they said squirrel shaming. And I think the marketing campaign is really cute. I like it. But this positive does turn into a negative because the section they were talking about this in the marketing campaign, they call the section winning hearts and minds. Like it is a cute campaign, but like you have to ruin it by being like, we were winning hearts and minds. Like they don't, take a poll of students of how effective the marketing was. Like it's so propagandistic again. Why can't you just call it how we marketed or the marketing campaign we made? Like it always has to be like, we did such an amazing job. Ugh. Okay, so now more into, I guess just the negatives and just more commentary. So first we're talking about them talking about money. Part one, I think I sort of commented on how it was sort of weird how they don't talk about money in part one. So because Suzanne Went, like the interim chancellor at the time, talking about like why they let students return during spring break, like March 2020, it was shocking to me that one of the reasons wasn't because we not want to lose money. That is a valid reason. Maybe it feels like ickier to say, but to me it feels more honest. Students being at campus, like the dining halls, living on campus, all of those things bring in a giant amount of money for the university. That is just a fact. So in part one, I was like, just name money as one of the reasons you let students come back. Like, it's fine, just say it. So I did appreciate in part two, they start to talk about sort of the finance side of handling COVID. They start talking about money, but in a way that's sort of like, it's not the reason we did any action. It's just something that exists. So for example, he's talking about Daniel Diermeier, who's like the chancellor now, bringing people back in person during COVID. You also have to ask, what are the consequences of not providing education? Because it's not like what we do is some luxury. We're providing transformative education and we're doing path-breaking research that has dramatically positive consequences for people's lives. It's like he's talking about basically what are the reasons that people need to even be on campus? Like, why can't we just move everything online? What would we be losing? Literally 10 pages later, they're like, and the endowment, like we're gonna lose a bunch of money from COVID. In this section, they're just like, what is our purpose? To provide a transformative education. We can't lose that. Students have to come back. I just wish, and all the reasons they're talking about students coming back, if each time they could please just reference money, because you're literally about to start talking about money, so you can stop pretending like, well, it's all about the education. I don't doubt that Diermeier cares about students' education, but you certainly care about the loss of money too. Like I said, like 10 pages later, they finally start talking about the endowment. Financial endowment is a legal structure for managing and in many cases indefinitely perpetuating a pool of financial, real estate, or other investments for a specific purpose according to the will of its founders and donors. Vanderbilt has this really large endowment of money. Presumably it's from like tuition, it's from donors, it's from all of these different things. And they also invest that money in different things to like grow the endowment. The endowment had totaled about $6.3 billion in fiscal 2019. That's such a giant endowment. But then they talk about how COVID-19 is going to affect that giant number. They say, but with stock markets diving in reaction to COVID-19, the endowment had shrunk by about $1 billion between February 20 and April 7th. A long-term loss in value that could affect annual endowment distributions for years to come. One of the comments about like why they wrote the book before COVID was over, because they can make statements like this, being like, we're gonna lose so much of the endowment money because of the COVID-19 precautions, sending students home. And they talk about stock markets diving. We all know that a lot of rich people made a lot of money during COVID. Those stock markets diving were bad for some, but also a great opportunity to buy stocks. Like when you buy stocks, you wanna buy them when they don't cost that much and then sell them when they cost a lot more so you can make some money. I assume Vanderbilt used that opportunity to buy a bunch of stocks, which is a smart thing to do. Like they have all this money, go ahead and buy the stocks when they're really low. They don't really talk about that. They're just like, we're gonna lose all this money. Like, oh no. And I think they're doing that as a way to be like, well, we can't provide this and this and this during COVID times. But I just looked up their endowment and I'll link below how you can go look it up. 2020 to 2021, they reported their endowment now being $10 billion. Let us remember that is now $4 billion more than it was when they wrote this book. So without a doubt, y'all invested a bunch of the endowment money when stock prices were low and you made a shit ton of money, which is fine. That's a smart financial decision, but you published the book before you could report the endowment growing by $4 billion. The financial report that I found, Diermeier basically says Vanderbilt's endowment now totals more than $10 billion, making ours one of the largest private university endowments in the United States. I'll link some articles below about like workers' unions at Vandy and stuff. One article I'll link below talks about basically Vanderbilt workers reflecting on labor conditions amid new union contracts negotiations. So the whole article is talking about how, workers are fighting to get better hours, better pay, better conditions, all of these things. Of course, this is not brought up in the book. I'm just bringing this up because the endowment's $10 billion and There are articles out there about workers at Vanderbilt needing better conditions and better pay, like having to fight for that. And then you're telling this sob story, like, our endowment's gonna shrink by $1 billion. Like, oh no, like, and it didn't. Like, I don't know. Altogether, that seems like a little icky to me. So then they start talking about all the losses. And so we've already heard endowment's gonna lose $1 billion. From that billion, about 68 million of the expected losses could be mitigated through belt tightening, hiring and salary freezes, voluntary separation by a relatively small number of staff. And then they go into the part that's annoying. The university would not escape the fiscal effects of COVID-19, but for the moment, it would be able to avoid more stringent measures, such as across the board layoffs and eliminating contributions to employee retirement funds. Many of its peer institutions were being forced to take. So years of foresight and careful stewardship had given Vanderbilt a solid balance sheet. It was in sound condition to weather the storm. Vanderbilt is a private university. The tuition is insane, which means in my mind, like, that creates a cycle because you're basically very, very rich people, besides like scholarships and things, are going to go to Vanderbilt. Therefore, those rich people are going to graduate from Vanderbilt, become alumni, and then give back to Vanderbilt and then become funders. So it's like this cycle of like continuing to let rich people in so that rich people will continue to donate, which is fine, whatever. But being like, it was years of foresight and careful stewardship had given Vanderbilt a solid balance sheet. I don't know if just having really high tuition and really rich people going to the school and donating could be described as careful stewardship and foresight. Like, comparing yourself to other schools, like other peer institutions have to lay people off and have all these different things because of COVID, not us. Maybe they have to do that because they literally just have less money. Like, students pay less tuition. They're public universities. Like, it's sort of gross. I'm like, what universities are you comparing to? Like, community colleges? You're like, yeah, we got more money than them. Fuck them. Like, just say that, like, this is where we're getting our money. Don't pretend like it's years of planning and you guys being so clever. You just charge a shit ton of money. Like, here's one of the examples of the major theme I had talked about in the beginning, where they talk about this like really good intervention, but they never reference any sort of outcome. The university also announced it would use the $2.8 million it was scheduled to receive as part of the Federal Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act to support students facing financial difficulty. So they're basically just talking about the criteria that you must meet to get this money. So each of the students that meet that criteria would receive $1,100, and some 20% of Vanderbilt students, split almost evenly among undergraduates, graduates, and professional students, would eventually receive the funds. They're talking about like future tense. So I go to the reference because what I want to see is data about how the funds were distributed. The reference goes to an article that says the exact same thing as what's in the book. I just would love to see some data about how this turned out. You know, you hadn't distributed the funds yet. Maybe you should wait to write the book until COVID is over, and then you could reference actual data to all the interventions. I think this book would be so much more compelling if they had waited till like, who knows when the pandemic's gonna be over. Let's say they waited till like 2024. The pandemic is a thing of the past. Then they published this book, and all the interventions they made, they can reference to data about the outcomes. So then we can go look and see, wow, Vandy, you actually did such a good job. We can see in numbers that you made interventions and you helped the student body. Otherwise, it just seems like sort of empty promises. I don't even know what happened. But I just told you that Vanderbilt's endowment is currently over $10 billion. Like, bill, not mill. Like, so much money is in that endowment. They're like, there were bumps in the road. While putting the pieces in place to test all students upon their arrival in mid-August, the PHCCC team discovered that thousands of testing kits they had ordered were not pre-assembled. We got the kits in pieces, not pre-packaged and ready to go like we'd expected, George recalls. So we had all the pieces shipped to the rec center, and we put out a call for volunteers to participate in a socially distanced test kit creation day. And in true Vanderbilt style, plenty of helpers showed up. It was $6 billion in the bank. They got people to volunteer to help put COVID tests together for free. What happened to all the fancy financial budgeting y'all had done to get ready for COVID? Y'all didn't have any money to pay people to do work. You know, the point of this was to be like, in true Vanderbilt style, plenty of helpers showed up. Like, Vanderbilt's such a community. All I'm seeing is that you guys just like use people's labor for free when you had $6 billion in the bank. Like, it's just not cute. They're talking about all the reasons students need to come back. And they're like, one of Vanderbilt's highest priorities, and along with resuming research, one of the two main reasons it was reopening campus was to create a close-knit community that lived, ate, learned, and played together. Sharing a dorm room with a roommate or two was part of that residential education and also a rite of passage for college students everywhere. But would any of it be possible during the pandemic? But again, you're talking about why you're bringing students back. Like, students must live in a dorm for college. It's part of the rites of passage. Just saying, I never lived in a dorm in college. Not for one day. I went to a commuter college. Like, I still liked college. It's just like not a rite of passage. But also, just say money. Just say it. You just talked about the endowment. You just talked about all this stuff with money. And now you're like, we have got to get students to live on campus because it's part of the residential education lifestyle. Talk about how much money you get from students living on campus versus not. Stop acting like everything's altruistic when it comes to talking about bringing students back to campus. We know it's a business. You're allowed to say it. Next, we're going to talk about social justice. In the book, they also talk about, so we're handling this viral pandemic, but we're also handling another kind of racial pandemic. Everyone knows during 2020, that's also when the George Floyd protests were happening. A lot of BLM protests were happening. And they say Vanderbilt, like many universities, had in recent years begun grappling with the racism intrinsic in its past and present. 4 days after George Floyd's death, the university issued a short statement that said, "In all our roles as educators, scholars, and stewards of the best ideas and values of civil society, we must be part of the national chorus that cries out that all lives are valuable. Furthermore, as a community, we should question why incidents such as these continue to occur and what role we can play in creating a fair and just world." Okay, thank you for referencing it. Thank you for talking about it happening, I guess. But be part of the national chorus that cries that all lives are valuable? That sounds real familiar to something else I was hearing. The national chorus that cries that all lives are valuable is synonymous to saying all lives matter. You should have said the cries that Black lives matter. That would be the time to say it. Not once in the book do they say that. All Lives Matter is basically a movement that is against BLM. It was a way for people to be like, well, BLM is nonsense. All lives matter. No, it wasn't a cute thing that people were saying in agreement with BLM. It was basically in opposition to what BLM was doing. So I think it's just crazy that they literally say all lives are valuable. And it's as a community, we should question why incidents such as these continue to occur. It's just such an academic way to talk about something that's happening. They're like, we must really sit down and ponder why this is happening. It's white supremacy is integral to policing. That's it. That's not a question. It feels like empty words. And it feels like they just said all lives matter. So I just didn't like that. And then they talk about Daniel Diermeier, the chancellor now, talking about equity and diversity and inclusion. And they talk about this virtual gathering that was live streamed on Zoom and YouTube, where Daniel Diermeier is talking about all of, COVID and the social justice issues. And Diermeier said, "We've done a lot at Vanderbilt in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we all have to ask ourselves, how do we do more in combating racism and social injustice?" He suggested that Vanderbilt double down on recruiting Black students and faculty. And so I went to the reference because they do reference something there. And it's just a link to this speech on YouTube, which I guess is a reference. This book is making me question what a real reference is. But I went and it's just him on YouTube. So I looked at the section, and I'll put the YouTube thing below. I think it's minute 12. He starts talking about Vanderbilt and the social justice issues. And he said, we need to bring diverse faculty into Vanderbilt and create a place where they can thrive. Again, this is one of those places where I wish they had referenced a list of real things Vanderbilt had done in response to this. As you have all probably seen, during BLM, many corporations were coming out because it was sort of the hip thing to do and being like, we support all Black people, we support our Black workers, we support blah, blah, blah. And like, thank you for not being actively hateful, but those are just words until there's action. Like, I'm not impressed by you saying we need to bring in more Black faculty. That's just a fact. How did you do it? How are you doing it? And I think that's why I'm having a hard time with this section, because it is like, the words are beautifully written. Like, besides that all lives are valuable, we all know what that means. But other than that, you're saying like, we need to create this environment and bring on these people, but how did you do it? You need to reference what you did. You can't just say things, put it in a book and send it to everybody. Like, in that section, I think they sort of failed at saying what exactly they did to bring in Black faculty. Like, you need to reference that. Next few pages, they sort of talk about more about what they actually did. I will give them that. They said they proposed expanding efforts to diversify the cohorts of faculty, staff, and students. It called for significantly increasing the budget for the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, bolstering bias and inclusive training, partnering with the city of Nashville, creating an ad hoc board of trust committee, confronting the racism in Vanderbilt's history, and among other actions. Like, some of that stuff is really sort of like nebulous ideas. Partnering with the city of Nashville is one. The police? They're part of the city of Nashville. Like, who are you talking about? Confronting the racism in Vanderbilt's history. What does that mean? Like, Diermeier like did a prayer, God, so sorry for Vanderbilt's racist past. Like, what exactly do you mean by confronting? Did you like start more classes for undergrads to talk about Black history, or like, it's just nebulous. I don't understand what some of this means, because it was like confronting racism in Vanderbilt's history and then among other actions and then a reference. So I went to the reference, like an article talking about Vanderbilt University is among the founding investors in something called Jumpstart Anova, which is the first venture fund in the United States to invest exclusively in Black founded and led companies at the forefront of healthcare innovation. That's awesome. But I'm saying in this whole section of the list they just said about what they're going to do for DEI efforts, that's the only thing that has a reference to going to an actual article about what they did. Of the entire list. That's the problem. Within the social justice section, they're like, the university's resolve was tested just 2 days later when an Instagram video of a Vanderbilt student using a racial slur, the N-word, renewed debate about racism in the university Greek system. Renewed debate. So academic, so meaningless. In a statement, the university said it condemns the language in the strongest possible terms and had referred the matter to its Title IX and Student Discrimination Office and was investigating the incident. Okay, so those are the 3 things they said they did. 4 if you count renewing the debate about racism in the university's Greek system. That shit was not renewed. That shit has been ongoing. Like, it's not renewing a library book. What are you talking about? These are the things they did. It's like, we sent it to Title IX, we sent it to the Student Discrimination Office, and we investigated the event. And then what happened? All they do is reference a statement where they were like, it is critically important that our community understands that this type of language, which undermines and erodes the culture of belonging and safety we have worked to create, is unacceptable in any context, the statement read. And for the millionth time, I feel like I've said this. Can you please reference what actually happened? What happened to the student? Were they expelled? To an article that talked about this incident, and it says, after receiving multiple reports regarding the incident, Dean of Students Mark Bandas said that the Title IX and Student Discrimination Office have been notified and are actively investigating. It's just words. Like, they're nice words. Like, they're like, don't say racial slurs. We don't like it. We're gonna start debating about if the Greek system's racist. Don't get us started. Like, what happened to the student, y'all? Like, can you please just report it so we know what you actually did? The student could have just gotten an email that said, hey, please don't say the N-word. Comment down below if you know what happened. Like, I had a meeting once with Dr. Andre Churchwell, and he has been in the social justice area for years. He's like the head of DEI at Vanderbilt. He was really encouraging to me. I wanted to ask him how I could get more involved with social justice on campus. He was so nice and understanding and offered me so much help. So I'm not saying DEI at Vanderbilt is not going well or anything. Like, there are really good people working on this at Vanderbilt. Take-it-home message is not Vanderbilt's not doing DEI well. That is not the message, okay? The message is, in this book, they bring up a lot of words, a lot of nice words about DEI without referencing any outcomes or what actually happened. That's the problem, because then it makes your words seem empty. So next we'll get into Vanderbilt talking about COVID. It's just parts in the book where they're talking about COVID in sort of like a crazy way. And you'll see what I mean. This part maybe should have been in the silly part of the video, but like it makes me laugh so hard. Okay, so they're talking about all the different things they're doing at Vanderbilt when students are away to handle COVID. And they're like, and faculty and grounds crew solved novel problems created by the shutdown. Story recalls, when out of the blue they said all sports seasons were canceled, I was like, what do we do with all the fields? In the end, we found ways to save time, labor, and expenses, like by spraying a growth regulator on the grass to slow it down. People are dying. People are dying. The world is shutting down. People lost their jobs. Whew. But y'all just had a whole last section about spraying growth regulator on the grass. And so they also have this section where they're talking about like the return to campus plan. Resuming a limited degree of in-person research was, in some ways, a test case for wider reopening, Copstein says. This will be an important opportunity to apply campus and building protocols more widely, blah, blah, blah. It's important that we get this right as a foundation for further scale up of campus activities. I just think the words test case are probably not the best words in this case. It's like we're sort of testing how well our protocols are going, and we're just going to bring all these people back to their labs and see if they all die of COVID. Like, I was one of those people. Like, I don't like the words test case. Okay, and then this gets into some of the most egregious ways that they talk about students and their parents and faculty. It's just so rude. Vanderbilt students were in an age group that appeared to be less likely to suffer dire effects from COVID-19. Quotes, there was a sense among students of, we're highly social, we're immortal, you can't tell us what to do, he says. What student said that? Who are you talking about? Like, it's such a rude way to talk about students, like they're just sort of dummies. They don't think they're immortal. So this section was sort of like a mix of positive and negative. I'm saying it's positive because they are acknowledging, getting a lot of pushback from people that are like, do not let students come back to campus under any circumstances. So they have a quote that was like from Robert Kelkin, an associate professor of higher education at Seton Hall. He says, whether colleges are willing to admit it or not, chaos will be greeting many of them in the coming weeks, and wishful thinking will not be enough to avoid it. Talking about students actually coming back to campus, economists in the New York Times said gathering students on campus is a gamble that could generate outsized risk for society and only modest benefits for students. Janet Murray, a professor at Georgia Institute of Technology, she likened the reasoning driving reopening to the engineering groupthink that resulted in the fatal failure of the O-ring on the Space Shuttle Challenger. So I appreciate that they didn't make it seem like it was everyone had the consensus that bringing students back to campus was just a danger that needed to be done for the sake of residential education. The Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs, Tracy George, described faculty responses to students coming back to campus as variable, but largely negative, highly critical, with certain themes coming through loudly: uncertainty, suspicion, and anger. Very few were positive about the decision. Even those who were positive questioned the soundness of our reasoning given approaches taken by our peers. The American Association of Universities Professors sent Diermeier and Wendt a petition calling for online instruction rather than in person. The petition was signed by 200 faculty members and several hundred more students, parents, and alumni. So they're getting like signed petitions being like, do not bring students back to campus. This is in response to that petition that's signed by hundreds. People like crying out, do not bring students back to campus, like you're making us feel unsafe. There's many of us who believe this to be true. Like all of that stuff I just said, they wrote it down and put it in here. Right after that section, Suzanne Wendt has this quote that is so rude. She's like, people were scared and upset at all the uncertainty and disruption in their lives. They had to get angry at someone. You couldn't get angry at the virus. The virus is something you had no control over. We took a lot of heat for any decision we made. Everybody felt like we were treating somebody badly, staff, faculty, or students, because there's nothing you could do with your anger about the situation and feeling like you had no control over your life. So we became the target. And we had to just keep calm, keep explaining, and keep providing rationale. We had to keep saying we would pivot and change if we needed to. It's so dismissive of what people were feeling. Like, people are immunocompromised. People feel like they're going to literally die from this like new novel virus. Like, they have real fears, and you're dismissing it as they're just like kind of angry babies. And we had to provide the rationale because they couldn't. Like, it's so rude. Diermeier talks about bringing students back to campus. He says, we asked ourselves, are we providing as safe an environment as people would have at home? And the answer was yes, he says. Vanderbilt has the world's best medical centers. And then he said, so when you come here, you're actually better off than at home. Where's your evidence of that? You can't just say things. This whole tone of them talking about COVID is like, we knew best. Everyone who was complaining was just having sort of irrational emotional responses, but it was our job to act as like the very rational thinkers. Like, very rude. Okay, and then the last part of the video is things again that just make me laugh. Like, Susan gave a commencement speech at the virtual commencement. I do like it. Like, she's like, I hope you have learned that nothing is so daunting that it cannot be explored, learned from, and ultimately overcome. Like, I like that sentiment. But then she ends the speech. She's like, this being Nashville, if I were to play a song for you right now, it would be the words written by Mark Sanders and Tia Sillers and sung by Leanne Womack. When you get a chance to sit it out or dance, I hope you dance. My opinion is that she should have been like, because this is Nashville, if I were to play a song for you, it would be Save a Horse, Ride a Cowboy. That's just my humble opinion. This one part where Daniel Du Bois is talking about plant operations, and my understanding of plant operations is they're the ones that do all the stuff around campus, like the landscaping, like just keeping the campus going. Talking about them, he's like, I don't think people understand how manual a lot of these projects are, says Daniel. There isn't a hotline for these things. It's easy to think, okay, let's put some light pole banners up along 25th Avenue. But someone has to actually go out there, count them, measure them, and get it done. Like, I get this is trying to compliment plant operations team. Like, they do deserve compliments. They're doing great. But it's just like, I don't think people realize someone actually has to do it. It's like going into a grocery store and being like, wait, every aisle is stocked. Did a person stock this? Like... What a strange realization. Okay, and then they have this whole section, I just want to bring it up. It's called The Return of Commodore Football. It's incredibly boring. It's just talking about the students either feeling comfortable coming back or not, how they're disinfecting like their workout facilities. They're like wearing masks. Some schools are not going back, some are. It's just like very boring. Maybe if you care about football, but I also thought it was weird. They only talk about football in this book. Like, Vanderbilt has other sports that we're better at. Maybe like the board of trust that this book was written for is really invested in football, and so they had to include it. I am done talking about this book today. So comment down below what you thought of this section, what you think of part 2, and the major theme being here that they just talk about interventions without ever talking about any outcomes, which to me is very suspicious and provides evidence of why they published this book before COVID was even close to being over. Stay tuned for part 3. I still haven't talked about how Vanderbilt talks about policing on campus. I haven't talked about how students return to campus and how that went. So there's still a lot to talk about. So please make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Again, subscribing really helps my channel. It's my goal to grow it as big as I can and to maybe turn this into a job one day. So please take a second to just go ahead and subscribe. I really appreciate it. And I will see you guys in part 3. Bye.